Okay, so I've done that. So we acknowledge that we are on the indigenous land of Coast Salish peoples who have reserved treaty rights to this land, specifically the Duwamish and the Snoqualmie Indian tribes. We thank these caretakers of this land who have lived and continue to live here since time immemorial. So that's where we are. Let's talk a little bit about who we are. I'm Erica Manias. I'm the director of the Issaquah History Museums. Joining me tonight is Karen. And I can't see Karen, but hopefully, actually, Karen, if you talk, I think your face will pop up. So maybe
I'm
if you say
here.
hi.
Hi.
Awesome. So Karen's going to be helping out tonight. She'll be looking for questions in the chat and hands. So if you prefer to raise hands and ask your question verbally, you can do that. So the Issaquah History Museums were founded in 1972, and back prior to the pandemic, we operated several museums, and we did a lot of community programming like history hikes and pub crawls and guided tours and hands-on history days where we got to get up close and personal with kids. And of course, none of that is feasible right now in the middle of a pandemic. So we have started holding these virtual happy hours. This is our 4th virtual event. So I think we're finally getting the hang of it. I introduced Karen. I know that Julie is here. I don't know if she's on camera, but Julie Hunter, our collections manager, is on board. And Kayla Boland will be joining us. She's our admin and communications coordinator. And she's also the genius behind all our social media. And Karen, I didn't give you your title. Karen is our programs and volunteer coordinator. So this evening's program is brought to you by Outsource Marketing. Outsource Marketing pioneered marketing outsourcing way back in 1997. Today, Outmark makes growing your organization fun by handling the heavy lifting of marketing, strategy, planning, management, creative, talent, and more, and integrating everything seamlessly for you. So thanks so much to Outmark for sponsoring this event and making it possible. And let's just jump on into it. So tonight we're talking about basically dead people, specifically the dead people of Issaquah. So we're going to talk about the people who are buried in Hillside Cemetery, and we're going to talk about some of the stories that we've heard about the dead who continue to walk. So if you went on the cemetery walk the other day, some of this will be review, but this will have the added benefit of pictures to go along with the stories. So this is a picture of Hillside Cemetery. And if you've ever been up to the cemetery, you know that it's really well named. It's perched on the side of Squawk Mountain. Burials in the cemetery go back to the 1880s. At that time, the cemetery property was owned by the Seattle Iron and Coal Company, and they had coal mines adjacent to the cemetery. So for probably the first 10 to 15 years, the cemetery was strictly used to bury coal miners and their families, but eventually it became used on a regular basis by other folks in the town. So and by 1915, the city of Issaquah had officially designated it as Issaquah's resting place. And plots were sold for either $5 or $10, presumably whether you got a single plot or a double plot. So the city didn't actually purchase the property until 1923, but it's owned the property since then. And the cemetery is cared for by a cemetery board, which is a combination of city employees, Flintoft employees, and citizens from Issaquah. So that is where the dead are now. And before they get there, they usually make a stop here. This is Flintoft's funeral home. So of course, not everyone who has services at Flintoft's goes to Hillside, and not everyone at Hillside has gone to Flintoft's, but Flintoft's is a pretty important industry here in Issaquah. It's a family-owned business, and quite a few of you have probably had some sort of a dealing with them if you've lived here for any period of time. You may have had the opportunity to take advantage of their services. So Flintoft's funeral home got it started in the late 1930s. Bill Flintoft had just graduated from a mortuary school in Seattle, and he and his wife, Alberta, had decided that they were going to look around for funeral home businesses to either purchase or kind of inherit from somebody. So they had a handshake deal with the coroner here in Issaquah, who was named Fisher, no relation to the Fisher Meats Fishers. and they had a handshake deal, but Fisher reneged. So the Flintofts got out here with all of their Seattle lives kind of tied up and expected to be able to operate this business, but Coroner Fisher had changed his mind. So the Flintoffs decided to stay anyway, and they're still here, and Fisher is long gone, so we can see how that turned out. But it's an interesting story how they ended up in this particular building. They were walking around downtown Issaquah. This building, of course, is on Sunset Way, and they happened to decide that this was a nice looking house, went up and knocked on the door, and the woman who answered was named Harriet Hobbs, and she was a widow. Her husband, Sam, had just passed away, and Alberta Flintoft said, you know, we really like your house. Would you consider selling it to us? And she said that actually she would. So they cut out the middleman, I guess. They didn't have to bother with a real estate agent. So the transaction went through, and ever since then, this has been the home of Flintoft's funeral home. Bill Flintoft was also a long-running mayor in Issaquah, and the only other person who's had a longer term was Ava Freisinger. So let's start talking about the deceased people. And I'll just give a brief content warning. Hopefully, if you signed up for a talk about graveyards and dead people, you understand that we're going to be talking about how people got to be dead, and a lot of those paths are not peaceful. So, so we will be talking about sad things. Yeah, that should cover it. So if you're feeling especially sensitive, you may want to take the night off. So our first friendly dead person is William Goggin. He has one of the first stones you see as you drive into Hillside Cemetery. And so that's what kind of attracted my attention. And his stone is sort of sitting there, kind of not surrounded by anything else. And it's really obvious. And it's also, as you can see, a pretty large stone. So I did some investigating to find out who is this man who has this nice prominent tombstone. And I found an article in the Issaquah Press from 1918. The headlines there, William Goggin dies alone in his homestead cabin. So, and the article tells the story of how he was found dead. A man named W.E. Holland, who was a shopkeeper, had come out to deliver some groceries and discovered that there were signs of neglect around the place. And so he feared that there was foul play. And so he went back to town and he got Tully Anderson, who was the town marshal at the time, and took him back out to take a look around and see what was going on. So they found that Mr. Goggin had deceased. He was about 68 years old, as far as, no, sorry, 58 years old, as far as they could tell. And when Deputy Coroner Fisher came out to look around and make a determination as to the cause of death, he decided that Goggin had died of alcoholism. So this is probably more of a judgment on Fisher's part than any actual medical conclusion, because Fisher was not a doctor, he didn't have any kind of medical training, and he would not have performed an autopsy. So I thought that was an interesting note. The townspeople checked in with Goggin's brothers back in Ashtabula Harbor, Ohio, and they said, yeah, you can go ahead and bury him there. In other words, they didn't want to pay to freight the body all the way back to Ohio, which is logical. And so Goggin was buried there. So, and in his, there wasn't a formal obituary, but in the newspaper article, the sort of final words about him were, Mr. Goggin has lived in this region for about 20 years, having held his homestead for 18 years. He was a bachelor and a man of industry. So because he was a bachelor, it's probably been a pretty long time since anybody visited his grave. So I kind of like to include him on the cemetery tour, not just because he's got a good story, but because I figure he probably doesn't get many visitors, and he's probably happy to see a crowd of about 10 to 15 people coming to talk about his life. So moving on to another pretty prominent, interesting stone. This is the grave of Jacinto Zadra. So along with families like the Bertoldis, the Marchettis, and the Pettiganas, Zadra came from the Tyrol region of Italy, where coal mining is a common industry. And so this is a theme that you see again and again in Issaquah's history. people moved from coal mining areas elsewhere in the world and elsewhere in the country to come live in Issaquah and work in the coal mines. So as a result, you actually had a large number of languages being spoken in Issaquah at this time period. And a lot of the different groups of coal miners were very tight knit as to what nation they came from. So, and there was no exception from the Tyroleans. So as far as we can tell, Zadra came to the United States in 1895. I don't know what he died of. He was only 38 at the time that he died. And about 2 years later, his wife remarried another Tyrolean immigrant. So again, kind of evidence of how tight knit they were. So I decided to translate what this said on his grave. Of course, the top is pretty easy. Born in Revo, Tyrol, in the year of 1869, died on the 27th of September, 1907. And then I wasn't real sure about the bottom part, and I started trying to translate it. And I found that what probably happened is that the family of Zadra went to talk to the stonecutter and told him what to write. And the stonecutter wrote it down phonetically. So there's a correction at the bottom of what the actual Italian would be for this particular phrase, but it's leaving behind a wife and 4 children. So that was his family. And that is all I can tell you about Jacinto Zadra, which is always really frustrating. As a historian, I always like to be able to figure out the whole story. So someday I'll figure out what he died of, and then I'll be able to share that. So this is the tombstone of Clark Harris. He is one of about 19 U.S. Civil War vets who found their way to Issaquah and died here and are buried at Hillside Cemetery. The main difference between Clark and the others who were buried there is that he was African American. He grew up a slave. He was born in Covington, Georgia, and when the Union Army came through in about 1864, he ran away with them and joined up. So he was only 14 years old, but he was made a drummer in the 14th U.S. Colored Infantry. So after he got out of the Army in 1866, he worked on a Mississippi steamboat for a while. He went up to Minnesota. He married, had 3 children, decided that this marriage wasn't working for him, moved to Iowa. In Iowa, he married again to a woman named Elizabeth, but her father was not very happy about the union because Harris had not gotten divorced from his first wife. So technically he was a bigamist, but Elizabeth didn't seem to mind. They had, let's see, they had 3 children and then another 10 children after moving to Seattle. And in 1910, was when Clark was right around 60, they moved to the Issaquah Valley in what was called the Upper Valley, which basically means driving south past where Front Street turns into the Issaquah-Hobart Road. But unfortunately, Clark Harris died suddenly of either a heart attack or peritonitis, depending on what record you believe, just a year later in 1911. So his wife, Elizabeth, tried to keep the farm in Issaquah going, but unfortunately was foreclosed upon. And sadly, because Harris never cleared up his first marriage, he was not able to leave his military pension to his current wife, or the woman that he considered to be his wife. And so that is the story of at least one of the Civil War vets who are resting at Hillside Cemetery. Okay, so this stone is a small one, but it's got a lot of layers. There are a number of stories that go with this. So Benjamin Laws, and this is what his stone says, was killed August 21st, 1900, aged 46 years, lost his life to save others, asleep in Jesus. So Ben Laws is yet another man who immigrated from England, came to the United States and worked in Pennsylvania as a coal miner for a while in the 1880s. And then he moved to Issaquah. He moved to Issaquah along with his wife, Elizabeth Kennedy Laws, and their children, and they shared a home with his cousin, Robert Legg, and Robert Legg's wife, Jenny, and their children. It was a very small house. The house is actually still standing on Sunset Way, and they packed a lot of people into that house. So Robert and Ben both worked in the coal mines, and as the stone says, in 1900, Ben Laws was killed in a mine accident. He and 4 other coal miners were killed when poisonous gases overcame them in the Issaquah and Superior mine. So Laws had actually gone back inside to save some of his friends, and that's the reference on the stone to lost his life to save others. So he left behind a wife and 8 children, the youngest of whom was just 6 weeks old at the time of his death. Now, Issaquah was fairly fortunate as a community. They didn't suffer a lot of coal mine fatalities. They didn't have any major cave-ins or anything, but coal mining was still a very dangerous occupation. And even though we didn't have a lot of massive loss of life, coal mining was just dangerous on a general day-to-day basis, and it took a toll on the men who worked in the coal mines. So that's the first story of this grave. The second story comes up 8 years later. Ben Law's cousin, Robert Legg, who you see there on the left, was going through some hard times. His wife, Jenny Fines Legg, was mentally ill. It's hard to go back in time and try and diagnose someone with a mental illness, but the illness she had caused her to have breaks with reality. And during those breaks with reality, she would have what they called spells in the family. And she would go outside and kind of roam around the forests for extended periods of time. And so she was out in the forests for several weeks and ended up getting very ill with exposure and eventually passing away of kidney failure. So she had 7 or 8 children at the time, and Robert Legg was a coal miner. He hadn't done any pre-planning. He didn't have a gravesite set aside, and he really didn't have many options. And so his cousin's wife, Elizabeth Kennedy Laws, said, well, no one's going to mind if you bury her on the grave with Ben. And so it was a somewhat unusual choice at that time to cremate someone, but they had Jenny cremated, and they came up and buried her on that grave along with Ben. And that's where she remains. And then, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. And then 33 years later, Jenny and Robert's son, George Legg, dies. He's in his 40s. It's sort of sudden. His brothers don't realize he's gone for a little while because he lives by himself. And when they finally realize it, they realize they need to do something. Again, George hadn't made any plans. He didn't have a plot set aside. And so, again, they decided, well, let's cremate him. We'll take him up to Hillside and we'll bury him on the grave along with Jenny and Ben. And so that's what they did. And I got that particular story from one of the guys who was involved in that third burial. And I have to tell a funny story because the first time I gave the cemetery walk this past weekend, I didn't mention that he'd been cremated. And so there was a very interesting mental image in several minds where they thought I was talking about an actual body being hauled up the hill at Hillside and then buried. And that was not the case. It wasn't quite that bad. It was a cremation. So I wanted to clarify that, but I also thought you might find the mistake amusing.
I had that thought. I wouldn't lie.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I came to my senses really quickly.
Right. Well, I'm glad that occurred to you. It would have been a funny mental image, but yeah, not a terribly dignified way to treat a dead body.
No.
So, but anyway, moving on. So now I've inserted a happy story among all the sad stories of death. So this is a brief light chapter. So the Wolds are one of the earliest white families who arrived in Issaquah. There are no living relatives of the family still living in the area, so we don't hear about them an awful lot. Lars Wold and 2 of his brothers, Ingebrigt and Peter, immigrated from Norway and ended up in Issaquah. And Lars had 4 kids. Ludwold and Andy Wold grew up and had jobs and had kids and did all the things that you expect young men to do. But the 2 women chose slightly different paths for themselves, and both of them made really interesting choices to my mind. So Mary Wold was the oldest daughter. She went and got education as a teacher, and then she went back and got education as a nurse. When World War I started, she joined the Red Cross and she became a nurse in Siberia. So this was a time period where if you were a young woman in Issaquah and you took the train to Seattle, that would get a write-up in the newspaper. So the idea that that a young woman from Issaquah went all the way to Siberia to work for the Red Cross is kind of mind-blowing. Wold also got educated. She ended up staying in Issaquah and working for the Standard Oil Company. And then on the side, she had her own poultry company. And in 1930, her poultry company was worth either $3,000 or $4,000. I can't remember. And she, at one point, got on a ship in 1932 and sailed to London for the World Poultry Congress, which again is a little bit mind-blowing, both that there's a World Poultry Congress and that she got on a boat and went to it. So the picture that you see here is one of my favorites. It's out of Sana Wold's photo album. And I wish that it was not as blurry of a picture, but I'm pretty sure that Mary would have taken it. And we're pretty sure that this is a meeting of the Odd Old Maids Club. So the Odd Old Maids Club was mentioned several times in the Issaquah press, but it was very clear that the editor really did not know what to make of it. The assumption was that, well, since they were calling themselves old maids, obviously the club must have something to do with finding a husband, but it was not. So of the two meetings that we know of, one of them, the girls dressed up in men's clothing and went fishing together early in the morning, and apparently did pretty well in the fishing department. And then another story is that they got dressed up like nursery rhyme characters and had a tea party. So we've got the girls, both Sana and Mary's, photo collections and photo albums in the Issaquah History Museum collection. And it's just so fun to see Issaquah through their eyes and see the things that they took pictures of. They both spent time in Seattle and they were very familiar with the theater and music and culture, but they were also very much of the farm, and you could see a lot of pictures in their photo album of them out helping their father with the haying and just doing very down-to-earth stuff like that. Sana also really loved her animals. Lots of pictures in her album of horses and chickens and cats and dogs and a parakeet even. So just really interesting people who I would love to be able to sit down and have coffee with.
Tea.
Or tea, yeah. Either one.
I don't know. You said they had a tea party or something.
Yeah. They did have a tea party, but they were also from a Danish and Norwegian family, so I have to imagine they liked strong coffee as well.
Oh yeah. Yep.
So, so next on our list is Calvin Vowell. His gravestone says Calvin M. Vowell, born at Coal Creek, Tennessee, November 18th, 1844. Died August 21st, 1900, age 55 years, 9 months, 3 days. So Calvin Vowell is one of the other Civil War vets who's buried here. You'll notice that he does not have the kind of standard issue Civil War stone. He's got a very individual stone. So he did serve in the Civil War, but he served in the 1st Tennessee Volunteer Infantry. So he is the only Confederate that we have buried here in Issaquah. So he was born in Tennessee and moved to Iowa, where he got married and had 2 children. And then he and his family, again, this is a familiar refrain, moved to Issaquah to work in the coal mines. You could probably guess that based on the fact that he was born at Coal Creek, that he's from a coal mining background. And he died in the same mine accident that claimed the life of Ben Laws. So what happened was that in August of 1900, the conditions were very dry. There were a number of forest fires that had been burning in the area of the coal mines. And several woodworkers from the coal mines had been cutting wood to take inside the mine to shore up tunnels and do construction inside the mine. And they had left some sawdust and wood shavings kind of scattered around the opening of the coal mine. So inevitably, this wood material caught fire, and the fans that were located inside the coal mines that were designed to pull fresh air into the mines for the coal miners to breathe, on that day instead pulled flames 200 feet into the coal mine, which caused huge clouds of poisonous gas to form. And 5 men were asphyxiated as part of that disaster. So what happened then was that Calvin Vowell's wife decided that she was going to bring legal action. So she filed suit against the Issaquah Coal Company, and she said, you know, that they had known that there were fires burning in the area. They should have known that they should have cleaned up the wood and materials. And so that the Issaquah Coal Company was responsible for her husband's death. And the first court that the case went through awarded her $10,000. So the Issaquah Coal Company accepted the blame for his death, basically said, yes, it is our fault that he's dead. But they said, you know, he was getting older and his attendance wasn't great and he had lost an eye and he was, quote, at the point in life where vibrancy begins to wane. So that's age 56 for if you're taking notes at home. Apparently 56 is when our vibrancy begins to wane. So the court found in favor of the mining company and said that instead of $10,000, Annie Vowell would receive $4,000 because that is the most she could have reasonably expected him to be able to earn during the remaining years of his life. So capitalism came calling and found Calvin Vowell's price to be $4,000, which is a little grim, but what can I say? It's a cemetery talk. So I'd love help with the word that I can't quite make out. It looks like eros, but I'm not sure if that makes poetic sense. But it says, when o'er thy silent grave something shadows creep, fond memory ever will her vigils keep. And there's a nice detail of one of the etchings on Vowell stone. He's got a lot of really interesting IOOF, International Order of Oddfellows scripts and things on his grave. So it's worth, I guess it's worth tramping up to the cemetery and taking a look. And let me know if you're going to go, because I love going up to the cemetery. So our next candidate, so he died peacefully as far as I know, but he does have some zesty stories attached to him. He was kind of what you'd think of as a standard mean SOB. So Howard Case was born in Pennsylvania in 1852, another coal miner. So he made his way to Issaquah with his wife and kids and got a job as a coal miner here. He also served as Issaquah's town marshal for about 6 years, from 1902 to 1903, and then again 1908 to 1913. It's important to know that town marshals at this time were appointed, but they didn't get any kind of training in law and order, and they didn't really have to have any qualifications other than having common sense, being quick on their feet, being able to handle drunks, and some other kind of common sense, you know, tough guy things like that. So Case was definitely tough enough for the job. So you see him here all in black on the left. He's kind of a grizzled fellow and he's carrying a hatchet. I don't know if he habitually carried a hatchet. I don't know if that was his weapon of choice. Maybe he was just doing a little woodworking, but he's standing outside Clark's Place Saloon with George Clark, who's standing there with him with the white beard. Kind of a fun note on this picture. If you look at the window on the right, you'll notice that there's a C and there's an S, but there's nothing on the pane in the middle. That window has at some point been broken and replaced, and they've not yet painted over it again. But this is Howard Case, just walking down the street of Issaquah with his hatchet. So he was definitely tough enough for the job, but he had a coal miner's biases. And what that meant is that he did not care for strike breakers. So Issaquah had a thriving coal economy, it had a thriving union, and the coal miners did not take kindly to people coming in to break strikes. Strikes were happening frequently at this time period. We're talking about 1904, and there was a lot of conflict and a lot of name calling. So when the first newspaper article came out about this incident that Case was involved in, it definitely made it sound like Case was the victim. What actually happened was that Howard Case and a mob of 20 people went into a bar where a strike breaker was enjoying a beer, walked up to him, and without identifying himself or saying much of anything, reached through Kondati, that's the name of the strikebreaker, Kondati's jacket to see if he could find any weapons. Well, Kondati was armed and he was understandably freaked out by being sort of accosted by 20 people in the bar. where he's trying to unwind after a hard day in the mines. And so he fled the bar out the back door, firing shots wildly behind him. So, okay, so the newspaper article is all about how this strikebreaker fired at the town marshal. Never mind that the town marshal had not identified himself as such at the time. So the case went to court. The strikebreaker, Kandati, ended up being called or found not guilty of the crime. So it's clear from this story that that Howard Case definitely had a coal miner's sensibilities. So Case and his wife moved to Seattle, where he died in 1917. But obviously he was buried back here in Issaquah at Hillside Cemetery.
Erica, there's a
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Virginia would like to know, where is this building?
This building? So this was Clark's Saloon, and it was somewhere on Front Street, and it's no longer standing. And I have a map somewhere of the saloon locations, and I'm not 100% sure if Clark's is on that map, but I will look at that, and I will follow up.
Great.
I'm making a note.
Thanks for your question, Virginia.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to George Cranick. So George Cranick was one of many immigrants to Issaquah. He came from Austro-Hungary. Austro-Hungary, again, is another one of these nations where there was a large coal mining population that came to Issaquah. And there were a number of families here of Austro-Hungarian descent. And again, this would have been one of the languages that you would hear frequently spoken in Issaquah. So George Cranick immigrated to the United States along with his wife and had made their way to Washington State by 1889. He was by all accounts a solid and reliable citizen. Folks spoke highly of him. And he owned his own home and was again employed in the coal mines. And he'd been a naturalized citizen since shortly before his arrival in the United States. So it is not known what errand sent him out this particular night in 1908. He was coming back from a piece of property that he owned, and he happened to stop by the house of George Bennett. Not a whole lot is known about George Bennett. Also at Bennett's house that night was a fellow named Joe Pete, who again, I don't know very much about, unfortunately. So we're not sure what transpired between the men, but Cranick fled the house at about 6:30 p.m. after shots were fired. He collapsed about 40 feet away from the door of the house and died about an hour later, never having regained consciousness. So the fatal shots were fired by George Bennett's single-barreled shotgun, which was loaded with birdshot. Bennett and Pete were inebriated at the time, and they told the town marshal that Cranick had committed suicide. Considering that the shot entered under Cranick's arm and ranged upward through his body, the suicide story was not holding a whole lot of water. And the next day at the inquest, the folks at the inquest agreed that suicide did not sound reasonable. So on January 14th, Bennett and Pete were sent to the county jail, where they hung around for a couple months waiting for trial. By March, Joe Pete was released because Bennett had finally admitted that he was the one that accidentally fired the fatal shot. So, and then in early April, a number of Issaquah residents went down to the depot, hopped on the train, and went to Seattle to testify at Bennett's trial. And among those testifying were Cranick's wife, Mary, and Cranick's two oldest children, George and Mary, who were 21 and 15 years old, respectively. The jury deliberated for 12 hours and returned a verdict of not guilty. So George Bennett got to go home and sleep in his bed. By 1910, he had moved out of the area, and he ended up living to the ripe old age of 90, where he died in Sacramento. So, and unfortunately, that's not quite the end of the story for the Cranick family. Their sorrows continued through 1908. They've received a lot of sympathy from their community members, and probably a trained social worker would have been handy to help them through the grieving process. And they had, of course, a 15-year-old daughter, and she began acting out, as they say. So she was accused, along with a friend of hers, of stealing clothes from other people in the Issaquah Valley. And so the town marshal sent her and Lillian to Seattle and sent them before Judge Frater, who was in charge of the juvenile court, which had just started at that time period. And the judge said, well, you know, it's a first time thing. Go forth, take the train home, behave. Well, they took the train home, almost. They got off a little early and they stole some more clothing. And so here you see the newspaper article with the title, which I love, Girls Are in More Trouble. So the girls who were sent from here last Thursday to appear before juvenile court were dismissed by Judge Frater. Lily Hosko returned here Monday evening, and Mary Cranick arrived home late Tuesday evening, having left the train at Bush's Siding and loitered in the valley. Well, nothing can come of a good of loitering, that's for sure. So this time when they went back to face the judge, he was much less likely to give them a lenient sentence. So Lillian Hosko was sent to the Washington State Girls Training School, I believe. So basically reform school. And Mary Cranick was sent to the Good Shepherd Home, and you see a picture of that on the slide. So the Good Shepherd Home is still standing, and it's now rented out to a number of nonprofit organizations in Seattle. But at the time Mary was sent there were two different wings. There was the penitent wing, which was for girls like Mary who were supposed to be penitent and repenting of their sins. And then there was another side that was an orphanage. And so all of the girls that were there learned sewing and diction and all kinds of fancy things. I wish I had a list in front of me, but she was well trained. They also worked in the laundry. And at some point, Mary met a young man who worked for his parents' dry cleaner. He lived in the U District, which is very close to Wallingford. So I'm not sure what happened, but there was some sort of clean laundry love connection that went on. And the two of them got married and they moved to California and they opened a sweet shop. So actually, even though the end of George Cranick's life was not too great, and it certainly caused a lot of pain and heartache for his family, Mary Cranick kind of pulled it together there in the end and, you know, got to help run a sweet shop. That sounds like a pretty happy ending. So on to more mayhem. So it's not going to give a whole lot away when I tell this story, because you can read the dates on the stone and you can kind of see what's happening. But Monroe Palmer was from an established family in Walla Walla. He grew up there, he married there, and he had 2 children there. But then he fell in with some ne'er-do-wells, as they say. And these ne'er-do-wells had a particular man that they were angry with, and they were planning to horsewhip this man. So you could see that Monroe was not making good choices. So word of these plans leaked out to the authorities, and the ne'er-do-wells thought that maybe Palmer was to blame. And so shortly after that, his house was set fire to and someone burned down his barn. So shortly after this incident, the Palmer family relocated from Walla Walla to Issaquah, probably looking for safer pastures and hopefully a better class of friends. So Palmer found work as a logger at one of the lumber mills in the area, but things were not going well for the couple. In January of 1912, the two of them had separated. Eleanor decided to take in some boarders so that she could help make ends meet. And so she took in a woman named Maisie Carr and Maisie Carr's daughter. So in the newspaper articles that would come out later, there are a lot of stories about how Maisie Carr made things hard on Monroe and was always getting in the way of his efforts to reconcile with his wife. So the newspaper articles kind of put all the blame on Maisie. And of course, they made a lot of the fact that she was a divorcee, which was supposedly very scandalous, but divorce was actually a lot more common than you would assume at that time period. So in reality, Maisie had divorced her husband. He was physically abusive, and so she was coming out of that relationship. And I doubt she deserved all the prejudice that she got in the newspapers. But basically, Monroe Palmer was not happy about his wife putting him out, and he made every opportunity to let her know that he really wanted to get back together. And that involved basically stalking her to dances at the town and glowering at her while other men decided maybe they didn't want to dance with this lady very much. So on at least one of these occasions, he was there with a knife and a gun, and the town marshal, our good friend Howard Case, with the hatchet, took the gun away from him, but he managed to find another gun. And a friend of his the next day noticed that he had a firearm and said, "Monroe, what are you going to do with the gun?" And Monroe said, "Well, you know, it's none of your business." And I believe he may have said, "It's none of your damn business. And if you tell anybody, I'll blow your head off." And so his friend said, "Okay, no problem. I won't tell anybody you have a gun." So a few nights after the dance that I mentioned, Palmer entered his estranged wife's house, shot Maisie Carr, shot his wife, and then shot himself in succession. So you can see here's the newspaper article, Issaquah murder and woman he shot down. And you see one of the headlights lines is interference by Mrs. Carr led to killing. So they're just going to blame it square on her. So he had a note in his pocket recommending where his children should go. So incidentally, the children of both families were all in the house at the time of the shooting. So both of the children were sent to live with different relatives. I cannot find out what happened to Maisie Carr's child. So while Maisie and Monroe Palmer both died immediately, Eleanor Palmer actually lingered for almost 2 months in the King County Hospital in Georgetown in a persistent vegetative state before finally succumbing to her injuries. And so in the end, Monroe Palmer got his wish. These stones are right next to each other up at Hillside. His wife didn't divorce him. They remained together side by side in their graves for eternity. And I have a few feelings about her family not ponying up to move her somewhere else. But anyway, I'm sure there were many extenuating circumstances that I'm not privy to. So another quick sad story. So this stone represents one of Issaquah's 100 plus flu pandemic deaths from 1918 and 1919. So Mary Castle was born in 1891 in Reading, Pennsylvania. Her parents were Austro-Hungarian, and her father was a coal miner. Again, this has become a refrain. They moved to Issaquah in 1893, and she met and married a man named Lorenzo Francis. So Lorenzo's family had a hotel at the intersection of Front and Sunset, where the gas station is today. And so the couple had one child who is pictured here named Floyd, who sadly died in infancy. And then during the flu epidemic, shortly before the epidemic, Mary had another child, and she and the baby sadly both died in the flu epidemic. Both of her brothers would also die within the next couple years of tuberculosis, which left her father alone, and he lived to be 90, which I'm sure was a mixed blessing after losing your children. Now a happy story. So I talk a lot about Doc Gibson in a lot of these stories. So Doc Gibson was, he was a part of some of the stories that we've talked about. He would have been there. He was employed by the coal mine company as their official doctor. So he probably would have been there the day of the coal mining accident when we lost Ben Laws and Calvin Vowell. He was the one that took Eleanor Palmer to the hospital in Georgetown. He was probably the one who delivered a number of these folks' babies. And he was just kind of wherever you needed a doctor, Doc Gibson was there. He knew how to deal with gunshot wounds. He knew how to deliver babies. He knew how to sew mill workers' fingertips back on again. And so he was very well thought of. I don't know much at all about his death. He died in 1946, and he was relatively old at that time, but I can tell you a little more about his life. So he came to the area in the late 1880s, and he served as a local physician for a pretty wide area around Issaquah. He was known for having very nice horses, and so he would ride one of his horses out to various districts to meet up with people who needed his help. In a publication in 1913, they wrote of him, "To say that Dr. Gibson is modest would be putting it lightly. He takes his public work as a part of everyday life and is unassuming in any respect. Pleasant, congenial, and friendly, he is especially fitted to head the commercial organization." So Doc Gibson, among other things, was the mayor several times off and on. He and another man named PJ Smith kind of took turns. And I just kind of picture the town council members coming to Doc Gibson and saying, "We can't find a mayor. Can you do it again this time?" Anybody who's been on a committee or a board where you're trying to find a president or a secretary is familiar with the struggle. And so Doc Gibson was such a great stand-up guy. He would step in and he'd be the mayor again because the town needed a mayor again. So his house stood on the corner of Andrews Street and Front Street, and it's no longer there. But the other thing that he really enjoyed was horticultural and botany. And the ginkgo tree that still stands there was planted by him. And we have a high school student to thank for it, who put out a petition at the time that his house was torn down.
Erica, there is
Yeah.
a question. Any
Yeah.
relation to Gibson Hall?
Yes. So I believe that Gibson Hall was actually named after his brother.
It was.
But I am not 100% sure about that. I can look that
Yes,
up.
it was.
Dave,
named
are you
after
on the
his
line?
brother.
Do you remember?
It was named after his brother, John Gibson. Yeah, John. And
All
I,
right.
I think John actually had died in a Kiwanis meeting. That's
Oh,
how I got
really?
his name. I think so.
Wow. That's a good death story I did not
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, I've got information on that. Well, my wife does.
Excellent. Thank you. All right.
Intriguing.
So an answer from the crowd. I'm happy to
And
have
there's
that.
one other thing. In your little picture on there,
Yeah.
Dr. Gibson's wife, her name was not Fanny. That was her nickname. Her real name was Sarah.
Oh, okay. Well, I just transcribed what was on the stone so people could read it.
Right.
So, but you know what? I believe we do have that
Yeah.
in our files correct.
Yeah.
So we've got the family information on that. So Issaquah's best documented ghosts. So we get a lot of questions about ghost stories. And we have a few that we can tell a little bit about. People tend to be kind of private when they come to ask a historian about ghosts. So I can tell you that there was a business on Front Street that was having some ghostly concerns, and they got in touch with me. And I was able to share with them that someone who lived at that property had died traumatically, not on the property, elsewhere, on a different continent entirely. But they thought that this was interesting information, and they used it to get a little more comfortable with the presence. And they felt like the presence was kind of communicating with their cat. So that is one partial ghost story I can tell you. I have another instance where somebody came in. She felt strongly that she was walking near a creek where someone had drowned, and she felt strongly that it was a small boy. So at the time, I was able to look up in the Issaquah Press and find the instance of a small boy drowning in that particular creek. But I went back to try and find that clipping again so that I could share it with you, because we have the Issaquah Press digitized and searchable, and I couldn't find it. Dun, dun, dun. So maybe the Issaquah Press archives are haunted. I'm not sure. But that is another partial ghost story I can tell you. So these two gentlemen, Ed Burnson and Alex Strenard, are the two best documented ghosts in Issaquah. They're associated with a building downtown, which is now an antique store. It's on Sunset Way. It's at 155 East Sunset, if you want to Google it or walk by. And the building was for a long time known as City Auto, and it was owned and operated by Alex Strenard and Ed Burnson. These two were very tight. They're buried right next to each other. They owned a business together, and they married sisters. So you know these guys had to get along well. So the woman who has had experiences with the ghosts says that they are helpful and friendly, and they actually helped save her from falling one day, and that they're most active upstairs in a storage area. And family members of the two men have said that the prankster spirits kind of sound like them. So on the other hand, other proprietors of the building have worked there for a long time and never felt any spectral breezes or encountered any wandering spirits. So is it haunted? Is it not haunted? Are some people just more sensitive to haunting than other people? Your mileage may vary on the answers to all these questions. So this is Alex Sternard on the left and Ed Burnson over there on the right. Not a haunting, but a prank. And of course, pranks are designed to make people think they're being haunted. So this is from an early November 1933 issue of the Issaquah Press. A reward of $10 will be paid to anyone giving information leading to the arrest and conviction of any person or persons who willfully and deliberately destroyed property at the home of Mrs. S.M. Alexander on the night of October 31st. Signed, Mrs. S.M. Alexander, Mayor. Let there be no mistake. She is the mayor, and her property was willfully and deliberately destroyed. What property do you think was destroyed? Tell us in the chat. I'll move on, and after you guys have had a chance to answer, I'll let you know the answer, what the answer is. But I'm sure that you can guess it. Public service announcement. This is a good way to get a historian to haunt you. I found this stone at Hillside. It says, "My wife, Pat." Whose wife? Don't know. Pat what? No idea. When was she born? Can't tell. When did she die? Who knows? Don't do this. Historians will visit your grave and they will stand there and smack themselves on the forehead while they do. So,
I
and if
love
you're-
the mystery,
yeah,
but I'm not a historian.
right, yeah. There's probably a way for me to figure out who's buried here, but they sure did make it easy. So, the Haunted Mansion. Okay, this is not actually a haunted mansion in Issaquah. I borrowed this picture off the internet because I thought it would be more interesting if there was a picture for you to look at. So we had some folks write to us years ago and say, you know, there was a haunted mansion and I'd love to know more about that. Can you help us figure it out? So the letter said, I was raised on Lake Sammamish, and when I was in grade school, junior high, and high school, there was a very strange mansion on Lake Sammamish near the state park that had fallen into ruins. As kids, we would play in it and make up scary stories as to its origin and history. Now, as an adult, I'm very curious about its true origin. Who built it? Who lived there? And why did they leave it? It was located on West Lake Sammamish Parkway near the spot where there are many sunken trees and logs not far from the shoreline. We always called it the Haunted Mansion or the Green Mansion. You could see it from the road, but you couldn't see it from the road, but it was visible from Lake Sammamish if you were in a boat. I believe it butted up against the Lewis property on the southwest end of the lake, not far from the state park. It was lakefront property completely covered in vines and blackberries, but we were always able to find our way to the house by following a small trail from the lake. It seemed like a mansion to us with 3 stories plus a basement and an attic, a brick exterior, fireplaces, and I still remember the flocked wallpaper in the living room. So we passed this information along to our crack team of on-the-spot Issaquah historians, also known as our mailing list. And many of our mailing list members and the friends that they forwarded our email along to remembered the house and its location. And a few helpful people actually remembered the name that was associated with it, which was Shaw. So with that information, I was able to start doing some sleuthing and find out who were the Shaws. So John Nivet Shaw married Gertrude Fagan in Illinois, and they settled in Seattle about 1899. So John Shaw was the president of the Commercial Importing Company, and they imported and sold coffee and spices, specifically Corona coffee and Hollywood spices. So they were very wealthy. That's a picture of their beautiful home on Capitol Hill, which is still standing. It is 7,000 square feet in size, and it was built in 1920. So you can find lots of documents on Ancestry.com that show that the Shaws traveled quite a bit by cruise ship, or well, by ship, to New York City, Vancouver, British Columbia, Tokyo, and Honolulu, among other destinations. So this was definitely their primary home. The house on Lake Sammamish was a secondary house. They probably acquired the property in the 1930s or 40s. Dan Greenwood, whose family is next door to the property that the Shaws owned, recalled that it was very elaborate. There were ponds and tennis courts and a boathouse. and that you could still see the remnants of the mill in some of the shallows along the water. And then there was a fancy multi-car garage. So this couple did not have any children. So when John Shaw died in 1953, he left everything to his wife. And when Gertrude Fagan Shaw died in 1957, settlement of her estate got a little complicated. So one of the things that she'd set up in her will was she wanted to leave a bequest to all the employees of the commercial importing company who had been there longer than 5 years. Great idea. The only problem was the company had been sold to someone else after John Shaw's death and before her death. So the lawyers got to argue about whether or not it made sense for her to be able to give anybody bequests out of the company that was no longer owned by her and her husband. So this got very complicated. To further complicate the bequest, the only people left to inherit were Gertrude Shaw's siblings, who ranged in age from 60 to 71 at the time their sister died in 1957. So we have no idea how many years it took to settle the Shaw estate, but Gertrude's siblings were of an age where it probably was passed along through their estates relatively quickly afterwards. So the Shaw property, whoops, I skipped a paragraph. So, or did I? I thought I had a map. I have a map here of where the property roughly is, so you can kind of get an idea. And here's Lewis Creek, and then the Lake Sammamish State Park is over there. And so then what about the ghost story? What about the story? There's a story about a maid who drowned in the pool. So what's that all about? Everybody seemed to know that story. So it's very well known, but it's very difficult to substantiate. So the Issaquah Press would definitely mention if somebody drowned in a pool on an estate near Issaquah. So there were several other drowning accidents that might have gotten tangled up in the story. So for example, Gertrude Fagan Shaw's brother, who worked for the commercial importing company, died on a fishing trip by drowning. There were also a number of drowning incidents at Lake Sammamish Park, including incidents of multiple drownings in 1907 and 1916. So there really doesn't seem to be a clear answer to the ghost story other than what's a haunted house without a ghost? You got to figure out some way for a ghost to be involved. So whether or not there were any drownings, somewhere between dozens and hundreds of kids who grew up in Issaquah kept reinforcing the story that this house was haunted. And even those who didn't necessarily believe the story of the haunting did enjoy capitalizing on the story for entertainment purposes. Longtime Issaquah resident Chuck Olson knew about the Shaw Mansion because his dad used to deliver coal there. And his grandparents owned Alexander's Beach Resort, which was on the other side of the lake from the Shaw Mansion. So every summer, he says, people from all over the states would come and camp at the resort. The kids were then our victims of the scary haunted house. We would load them in our boat and take them to the house. One of my cousins would run up to the house and hide, and when the victims entered the house, they would be scared to you know where. So that's the story of the haunted mansion. And I wish that there were a real ghost, but well, maybe there is. Maybe there is. That's the thing. You can't say that there's not, can you? And this again is where it was located. So we've had a number of ghost hunters come to Issaquah and wander around in the historic buildings. And they usually come, they have a team of folks with lights and sensors and cameras, and they usually have a psychic with them. So I'm going to just tell all this, and it's up to you whether you believe in this stuff or not. But here's what I've been told. So there are ghosts at the Grand Central Hotel. It is haunted. Unfortunately, most of the stories involving the ghosts mix allegations of assault with historic fact. And since I can't find any substantiation of the stories of the assault, I don't really want to share the historical fact part that's associated with it, because then that's not historic fact. But if you happen to go into the Grand Central, be on the lookout. There may be ghosts. And I think the owners of the building have kind of, or at least for a while, I don't know if it's still there, there was a mannequin, a scary mannequin up in their upper window to sort of reinforce the idea that the building was haunted. We also had I call them Ghostbusters, but they were paranormal investigators. So we had paranormal investigators come to the depot as well. And I think my big takeaway there was they heard the sound of a young boy running. Of course, the depot's been open for 100 years in one shape or another. And unless you got a name for me that I can research, I don't know, little boy running. Okay, I'll take it. It's a ghost. It's a little boy running. So Gilman Town Hall and Jail. So we had the paranormal investigators come check out the Gilman Town Hall and the jail. So they sensed a heavy-set red-headed man weeping in the jail. So the jail was in use from 1914 until 1930, and literally hundreds of people went through the jail. It was used as a drunk tank during big celebrations like the rodeo, when they just kind of packed as many people in as they could and then let them all out at the end of the day. So chances of a redheaded man weeping in the jail at some point, pretty good. I wish that I had a research index of all the known redheaded men to have lived in Issaquah, but barring that, I guess I can't really do research there. But when they got to the Gilman Town Hall, they sensed something. And they were not the first. There were others who had sensed things in the Gilman Town Hall. A number of volunteers who worked in collections, and more than one collections manager, although not all, have sensed a sort of ghostly presence at the Gilman Town Hall. When I first started working at the organization, the museum was filled with several years worth of unprocessed artifacts, and it was pretty hard to find anything. But one day I found a file full of stuff I'd been looking for on a table where I was pretty sure there had not been a file before. So we knew that the person who worked in the museum before me was a volunteer, and she put in something like 40 hours a week, and the museum was just her life and her heart and soul. She did not die at the Gilman Town Hall, but she did die with paperwork related to the organization in her lap of a heart attack. So I was not surprised when the not Ghostbusters, the paranormal investigators told us that they sensed someone at the Gilman Town Hall, a woman with heart trouble. So there you have it. We decided that we obviously work in a haunted building. Or do we? Do we? Opinions differ. So those are my ghost stories. At this point, if any of you know ghost stories that you'd like to share about Issaquah, that would be fabulous. I'm always asking, and people are often pretty shy about ghost stories. So if you've had any spectral presences in your life in Issaquah, let us know. Otherwise, I'll keep talking.
Well, for one thing, there is a question.
Okay.
Are there any ghost stories related to the coal mines or the hikes on Cougar Mountain or Grand Ridge area?
So I did have someone tell me years ago that she was a Wiccan, and that she and her friends went up to Grand Ridge to commune with the spirits of men who had died in the coal mines. The only challenge is that I know all the fatalities in Issaquah, and there weren't any at Grand Ridge. So I'm sorry, the historian giveth and the historian taketh away.
So, but Katie would also like to share a ghost story.
Oh, yay.
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm Karen's daughter.
Hey, Katie.
I grew up in Issaquah. I was part of the Village Theater Kids Stage program, and any Kids Stage kid pre the new renovated building will say with 100% certainty that first stage was haunted. So I heard like 8 different stories about who it could possibly be, but like kind of consensus was, you know, standard theater lore. Actress hanged herself, and that she roamed. And I mean, we all have our own stories about crazy things that happened where we heard footsteps of someone following us when we were running back to get our keys before we left for the night and all of that business. But yeah, so I would be interested to know if there's anything about anyone dying in first stage, or if it's a bunch of teenage hormones creating poltergeists or whatever. So.
Well, I can't tell you it never happened, but I can't tell you that I can tell you that I've never found evidence of it. But I had heard, and I can't believe I forgot that when I was putting this program together, but I had heard about first stage being haunted. And that there were, I think at one point there was some like just insane flood in the building that no one could explain, and just lots of strange things. But then first stage was actually, the original building was torn down. It was kind of too far gone, and the Village Theater wanted to be able to use that for their first stage and their kids stage programs. And so they rebuilt it, but they rebuilt it a little bit wider so that it would better suit their needs. And apparently, what I've been told by other Village Theater folks is that after the rebuilding of the theater, the ghost no longer came around.
Yeah, I was there for the. I was working there when it was being rebuilt, and
Okay.
I can tell you that before, it felt very haunted, and then after, it did not feel very haunted. So I was
Interesting.
also about 5 years older, so I don't know.
So I don't know.
I don't know. Skeptics abound, but
Right,
fun
right.
story. It's a fun time. I think any kid stage kid who grew up in that building has.
Well, you know, you
memory.
need, as a kid, you need to have a haunted house or a creepy place that you go that you don't know about, that people tell stories about. You know, you need, it's, you know, it's good to get your pants scared off you when you're a kid every now and again, I think.
It is.
By the way, Erica, there are other people who have haunted stories
Oh,
that
great.
are in the chats if you would like to look at those.
Yeah.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Oh, the property that that Mayor Alexander was so mad about. Did we have guesses? Yes, we had some good guesses. Her outhouse. Someone tipped over. Actually, it wasn't someone. I know who it was because he admitted it to me. But yeah, he has since passed away, and I'm still bearing his secret. But yeah, they tipped over her outhouse. And so let's see. I saw a couple questions. Let me go back to the chat. Let's see. Okay, somebody asked about the building, Gibson Hall.
Oh, it's Virginia down toward the bottom.
Okay.
Yeah. And then Jean McMullen too.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I heard years ago that there was a Native American connection to the plot kitty corner to the Eastridge Church across from the Fieldstone and hauntings there. Okay, I had not heard that before. And then Jean McMullen, hi, good to see you here. Good to see you here. So KGR Radio had their haunted house for many years by the sand and gravel pit. Several participants claimed they saw apparitions that weren't a part of the haunted house theatrics. Nice. All right, we'll hang on to those to tell next time. Anybody else got any stories?
I have a question about Dr. Gibson.
Yeah.
So he delivered a lot of people's babies, and I imagine a lot of those babies, not a lot, but I imagine there were babies that did not survive childbirth.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious to know if any of those, I don't know, I'm curious if you know anything about that.
So I don't know anything. I mean, I've noticed that in history, like, you know, I've noticed it in death records and things when there are newborn or stillborn children who are born. I think that I don't have a whole lot of information about that. That's an interesting question.
Well, the reason I say that is because I just shared this story with somebody else just the other day, but I saw a woman, I don't know how many years ago, but in the middle of the night near where, I didn't know this then, but now I do from listening to you before, near where Dr. Gibson's place was. I saw a woman in the middle of the night in the fog. She looked like she was from to me, the 1800s, but I'm not a historian and I don't really know.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like she was mourning the loss of perhaps a child.
Mm-hmm.
And she was
Yeah.
standing there crying, and it was the middle of the night. It's probably October. It was really creepy outside. Beautiful,
Right.
beautiful, but it was just really interesting. But
Wow.
I didn't know anything about Dr. Gibson or anything until about a couple weeks ago when you did a talk on that.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because we've got this, because of course infant mortality was more common then than it is now,
Mhm.
thankfully. But I think it's interesting. I always had the assumption that, well, it happened more often, so it must have been easier then than it is now to lose a child. And after I had children, I realized that is not true at all. There's no way that it could be any easier at any other period of time to
It was
lose a child.
probably less common to talk about it.
Yeah, and they would have had to kind of bear their sorrow a lot more stoically because they had so much other stuff to continue doing as part of their daily lives.
The
So,
farms and the chickens.
yep, yeah, that stuff doesn't wait. You got to keep
Mhm.
moving.
Yep.
So,
Thank you. Thank you.
yeah, sure thing. So I would be remiss if I did not mention our fall campaign. I want to thank you all for making a donation tonight to listen to me share this information with you. I hope that you had a good time. Our 2021 calendar includes 10 more virtual history happy hours like this on a variety of different topics. We'll have our calendar ready within the next month or so. And I don't have to tell you that 2020 has been a very challenging year for small museums. We've not been able to count on our regular earned income sources, and we are definitely looking for ways to generate income. We have had some budget cuts at the museums. So if you enjoyed this and you feel moved to make another donation, I would encourage you to go to our annual fund website, which I will type the address of in the chat. And yeah. So there's that, if anyone's moved. You'll also notice that we've got a bunch of social media posts that have been coming out about different objects in our collection, some kind of highlights of some of those, and those are also available on the annual fund page. Whoops, I sent that privately to my sister. Let's send it to everybody. There we go. Okay. No, that's not it either. Oh, it's pasting the Zoom. Karen, can you type the
Yes, I sure
link
will.
into the chat? Thank you. It's good to have friends. So our next program is going to be on December 3rd, Issaquah's cast of characters. So Doug Bristol and Brian Thorne, who lead the coal mining hikes, are going to be joining us and sharing a few funny stories about the 1900 Issaquah fire, the Issaquah Seattle sewage war. I've been studying Issaquah for 21 years, and I have no idea what the Issaquah Seattle sewage war is, so I'm really looking forward to that. And the unflagging attempts of one woman to end the Issaquah rodeo, which took place between 1924 and 1932. So again, thank you so much for joining us. If you like this, you might want to take a look at our website. We've got tons of information there, as long as information on how to join us for other events like this. And of course, we'd love it if you followed us on social media. We share all kinds of interesting images, stories, facts, and observations that we'd love for you to have access to. And that is it for me for tonight. So unless you have other questions about Issaquah's history, want to play Stump the Historian, that is the end of our program tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Erica.
You're very welcome.
I will be putting that link up in 1 second. I can't get back. Why can't
I think I got it.
I can't get back to it?
I've got it. It's in
Okay.
there. So
Great, thank you. Sorry about that.
that's okay.
Good night, everybody.
Night, thank
Night.
you. I keep clicking on your picture to join and it's not letting me join. Back to, here we go. All right.
Join now.
There we go.
All right. Well, I'm going to log off and go have my dinner.
Great.
Thank you guys for
Bye,
tuning
guys.
in.
Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate you. Thank you so much. Have a good night.